Hi, everybody. The purpose of this slideshow is to give you kind of a broad overview of nationalism and how it began to work in the latter half of the 19th century in Europe. And while we're doing that, to also talk about the unification of Germany and Italy. This will kind of serve as an overview of like late 19th century European politics, but really those politics were dominated by this ism of nationalism, which really came out of the Industrial Revolution and stuff like that. So it gives you not only the theory behind it, but also some of the events that happened kind of in and around it, if that makes sense. And essentially, what I'm going to be arguing you today is that like the Congress of Vienna and the like Concert of Europe that came out as a result of like all of this, like basically like stalled the progress that the working classes thought they had made. That like the working class of like first like the French Revolution to come out of that, like and then like some of the stuff like during the industrial revolution. Granted, like the Congress of Vienna occurred before that actually happened. Some of the industrial revolution on the continent and the events of 1848, but the systems put in place by the Congress of Vienna meant that when those working class like movements like came about, they stalled hardcore. And the end result was like an adversarial relationship with the hierarchy trying to like hold on in place, and the rich and upper classes up top, the fat cats of capitalism, versus kind of the lower and oppressed like working classes, but now in the cities rather than on the farms and the serfs and stuff along those lines. And as a result, the lower classes were looking for kind of a common theme, a common idea, a common unifier, etc., as Giuseppe Mazzini pointed out in his On Nationality. And nationalism became that. It became like a sense of belonging that they could have. And it started with a young, strong working class. And the end result was like this new idea of a nation state, an outburst of nationalism, which really impacted war and politics on the European stage. And eventually the reunification of Germany and Italy. Because if you're not aware of this, and I brought this up like earlier, but I kind of said it in passing, and we didn't do a hardcore map thing because we're in a COVID situation. While people would consider themselves German or Italian at this time, they were a series of small states without a unified central thing, and they actually didn't become countries until 1870 and 1871, respectively. They're actually younger countries than the United States, to give you an idea. Okay, now, in order to understand like nationalism and how it worked, and then to consequently understand the unifications and stuff like that, we have to first start with like the formation of the working class, because as Mazzini theorized, and I've already talked about in class by the time you listen to this or get to this slideshow in here, when we read on nationality, it takes a strong young working class who feels the need to create a sense of belonging in order for strong nationalist movements to take hold in Europe. And the Young Italy movement is the perfect example of that. Conversely, you see stuff in Russia. Russia doesn't have a strong young working class, and you don't have a strong nationalist movement in Russia until later on, when you actually do get that rallied by Lenin in the early part of the 20th century, right? You have a strong like intellectual class that can like theorize about revolution, but they don't have the kind of foot soldiers on the ground behind them, you're going to have in a Young Italy movement or something along those lines, to also kind of push it forward and stuff like that. Um, and so, as such, it's important to understand, how you kind of got the formation of the European working class, and like what the end result of that was. And historians have broken this down into like a four-step thing that I could give you a long, like 8-page article to read about, and I have done in the past when we haven't been in a COVID situation, or I could sit here and kind of sum it up for you in about 5 minutes or so lecture-wise. So we're going to go with the latter this time, since we are in an online COVID situation, and just do it that way. And what they argue is this: is that to begin with, in the formation of the working class, the first thing you need is the structure of like capitalist economic development, because capitalism did take hold despite the efforts of Marx and communism and stuff like that, and other things that came up. Capitalism really did take hold during the IR, especially during the early part of the IR, but also in the later part of the IR. And while capitalism argues that eventually, because of competition, workers' profits will rise and stuff like that, early on in capitalism, it very much allows for like a free market way of working and paying and stuff like that. And the end result is that like when capitalism is first taking root in a country, without checks on it, it really allows the upper middle class to like really get super rich at the expense of the working class. You see that in places like where capitalism like emerged within like places in Southeast Asia hardcore within the last 40 to 50 years, and they have a massive like middle class, and the wealth gap got even bigger and stuff along those lines. Now theoretically this doesn't happen as capitalism like takes hold further on and things balance themselves out, but that's definitely what's going on at this point. And one of those things where like from the point of view of the people that own the factories, the people working in the factories are a dime a dozen, and so they're going to try to maximize their profits at the expense of the workers and stuff like that. Um, the second part of this, okay, is the idea of like social organization as a result of that, okay? Because so first of all, you've got like you create a system where like people are maximizing their profit at the expense of workers, which means some people get really rich and other people don't, right? But that doesn't necessarily lead to the idea of class and the working class and stuff like that. You need to take it further to make it like a social and cultural thing. And the next part becomes the social organization of society. And while this didn't happen as much on farms, though it was definitely true, like some farmland was more arable than other, and therefore more desirable than other and stuff like that. By the time you get into cities and regions and stuff like that, you get areas like this where like there's a social organization of society, and some areas are more desirable than others. And so people with more money live in one place, and people with less money generally tend to live in another place. It's not a perfectly rigid system in any way whatsoever, but you can speak about it in generalities. And you can think about that by looking at like where you live versus like maybe up on the plateau versus maybe like further south, like in the Puget Sound, like down either in like like I don't know, like kind of south of 405 or stuff like that. Generally, like this area and the east side tends to be more desirable than that, right? And so generally people who happen to like have the same income level congregate in the same area because houses cost the same and stuff along those lines, etc., etc. Okay, so you've got first the structure, right, which creates the rich and the poor. Then you've got kind of the congregation between like the rich and the poor and stuff like that. And then what you get to is the formation of shared social dispositions. And what experts and historians mean by this is they mean that like, eventually once people like, live together and have similar ideas together and work together and stuff like that, they start to like and dislike common things. So like, for example, the example that occurs during the Industrial Revolution is like, it becomes like cricket becomes like the rich man's game and soccer becomes like the poor man's game, right? So like, for example, like, the poorer people don't have time they need to work, they need to spend their time working, the working class, and so they don't have time to play cricket and stuff like that. And so eventually they create their own game, and it becomes kind of a like working class thing, and so like that becomes kind of a shared like or dislike. You see similar things happen with food and stuff like that. The working class people, for example, might like have to buy like poorer cuts of meat that like aren't considered as good, but then they'll find really creative ways to cook them, creating their own like unique like cuisine or something along those lines, creating like shared social dispositions, right? And then the fourth thing that kind of acts and binds the class together and creates the working class in Europe is then like collective action. Because once people like live together, they have shared social dispositions, they have shared economic development and stuff like that, then they begin to take collective action and they do things like organize politically and socially. And this is the beginning of things like labor unions and stuff along those lines. That allow the working class to have a much stronger political voice and social voice than it would be if they were just kind of like, like acting individually. Okay, so now that you have a burgeoning working class in Europe, how does that lead us to nationalism here? Well, as Mazzini argued, this idea of nationalism gives the working class a sense of belonging that they didn't have prior to this, and he would argue this begins with a major increase in nationalism with revolutions of 1848. Once ideas of communism and stuff like that come up, or even just kind of socialism and the idea that the state serves the people, right? The modern liberal state and the state serves the people, then people start to become loyal to the state rather than loyal to like a king or something along those lines. And they start to bond this loyalty around like a shared like history and culture and stuff like that. And that is the idea of nationalism. And it invokes everything: history, culture, language, territory, religion, etc., etc. At Europe in this time, it blurs the lines of the political spectrum and involves like both liberals and conservatives. And it leads to people saying like, hey, like this really like puts puts forward my ideas in my country, and it really makes people feel like, better about themselves and what their country's done as a result of that. Um, and like the end result is a shift in the political spectrum so that the modern liberal state exists, so that like people might like their leader, but they're way more loyal to the state. And it leads to the formation of something called the nation state, okay? Now, a nation state is a nation, which is a group of people with a common culture and history that has its own state, which is an independent government, okay? Think of it like this back in the day. Back in the day in Greece, you had like city-states, if you remember stuff like that, like Athens and Sparta. It was a city with its own like government and stuff like that. You happen to live in the state of Washington, so you actually live in a state. We call the group of people with our common language a state that has its own government, a state, right? A nation state is literally that. It is the modern nation with its own independent government, right? So any modern nation, for the most part, is a nation state. The United States, Britain, Canada, Germany, France, Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, India, China, I mean, like everything, right? Like, just for the record, by the way, though, you can't have nations without states. Okay, like so. For example, when like the Polish government absconded to London during 1939, or like the Baltics had really no government during like the Cold War or stuff like that. Those were nations that didn't really have like actual states, and you can also have like states without nations. Like for example, Palestine like has a president, has a group of people that like supposedly govern it, but it doesn't have a nation that's actually recognized by a large part of the world and stuff like that. So this leads to the formation of the nation state. And one of the key results of that, y'all, is the idea of unification of both Germany and Italy. Because as nationalism pops up, all these little states start to say, okay, well, instead of being loyal to like my friends, I more like feel German or feel Italian. Maybe we should all like bind together to actually create this country that like has just kind of been like sitting there, but not really actually fully together. Okay, for the unification of Germany and Italy in class, you're going to take a look at page 663 to 665 and take notes, and then we're going to discuss. I'm going to go over very, very quickly, like in 2 minutes, 3 minutes, if that, the unification on the next page with some pictures and stuff like that, but most of the information and stuff should come from your textbook reading and notes and stuff like that. Basically, you can divide the unification of Italy, oversimplifying it, and again, you're supposed to read your textbook to get the vast majority of how this works, into three key parts. You have the northern Italy, you have southern Italy, and then you have the Papal States, right? Northern Italy tended to be the rich part of Italy, it tended to be the intellectual part of Italy, it tended to be, for the most part, the more democratic part of Italy, too, if that makes sense. And Sardinia, which is one of the states in the north, has a prime minister by the name of Camillo di Cavour. And he and the Prince of Sardinia basically decide that together they're going to try to gain control of most of northern Italy. And there's a map of this in your textbook, and I'll show you a picture of it in a second. The problem is that part of that's controlled by the Austrian Empire. So they create a political situation in which they got Austria and France to kind of fight each other again, and then they because remember Austria and France are kind of the classic enemies here for each other. It was always England versus Germany, and then Austria versus France. And it drives the Austrian out, and then the Italians are able to pay Napoleon III off a little bit and take over large swaths of northern Italy. And so they're going to do it mainly diplomatically and with some help of other people. Meanwhile, in southern Italy, this dude by the name of Giuseppe Garibaldi leads a nationalist movement called the Red Shirts that begins in Sicily. And they just kind of slowly, if you think of Italy as shaped like a boot and Sicily being the island or ball that's kicking or something like that, they start on Sicily and they just kind of slowly, almost like a layer cake, make their way up Italy, conquering parts of it and drawing in other states. Uniting the country. And they're being secretly funded by Sardinia and people in the north. And the Sardinian army sends itself down to meet them in the middle. And at this point, Garibaldi does what everybody was worried about, which is he steps aside and he, instead of having the army and stuff like that, he backs down. He says this is the army of Italy, and he allows Sardinia and Victor Emmanuel, who's going to become king, to start to take over both parts of Italy that's been mostly united. And I'll get to the rest in 1 second. There's Cavour right there on the left. There's Garibaldi on the right and his red shirts. This was all part of Mazzini's kind of like young nationalist movement that then turned into the red shirts movement and stuff like this. Northern Italy on the left, southern Italy on the right. And this is going to be Victor Emmanuel II. He's going to be the second king of Italy. The first king, Victor Emmanuel I, doesn't actually rule for that long. And plus, Victor Emmanuel II has a much cooler mustache and beard that's worth putting up here because he's going to be king of Italy for an extended period of time, almost till like, Mussolini takes over in World War II, or right, sorry, not World War II, in the 1920s, early 1920s. And this is what I was saying about the unification is like, you had this part up here, like, Sardinia, which is in blue, and then like all this stuff in purple conquered by Sardinia and Garibaldi and stuff like that, and they're going to unite. And then all they got to do is take over Venice, which they can do kind of by annexing it, by saying, because it's right next to Austria-Hungary and ruled by that, hey, aren't you really more Italian than you are Austria-Hungarian? And they kind of vote to leave, and Austria-Hungary can't really do a whole lot about it unless they want to risk war with all of Italy and stuff like that. And then finally, they've got this like red part right here in Rome, which is the Papal States, which was run by the Pope. And basically, having united all the rest of Italy, they go to the Pope and they give him two options. And they're like, Pope, you can either give us large parts of the Papal State, we'll give you the Vatican City, and you'll be set, and that's what you're going to have, and that's going to be kind of your domain. Or we can take it from you by force, and you won't have anything. And after thinking about this for a while, the Pope decides to give it up. They give him Vatican City, which is the world's smallest state. It is actually a little bit of Rome, a little bit of the city, a few blocks that are carved out. That is technically a theocracy of about 811 people ruled by the Pope. There's not even a border, though, when you go to look at it, though. You can go get your passport stamp there and stuff like that. And now Italy is, like, fully united by, like, 1870. The unification was complete, as it said in the book. Okay, so now that Italy's unified, the other country that we need to talk about with nationalism, because it also kind of be a pretty big player in 20th century European history, is Germany, right? And this is Germany in 1815, and as you can see, it's a series of small patchwork states, the largest and most important of which is Prussia. And I've been telling you to kind of use Prussia and Germany interchangeably, because what's going to happen is Prussia, which is where Berlin is and stuff like that, is going to slowly overtake the rest of Germany and unite it here. And it's going to do that under the reign of this dude, one of the most controversial and also one of the most important figures in all of European history, a dude by the name of Otto von Bismarck, also known as the Iron Chancellor. And he's going to basically make enough political moves and machinations that he earns the hatred and the envy of like all of Europe, and puts Germany in a really dominant position in Europe going into the beginning of like the 20th century. So who is Bismarck? Well, he was a member of the Junker, which I'm actually told should be pronounced something like Junkia, or something like that, but I'm not going to try to say it in German or anything like that. Class, which is kind of like the landed gentry and noble class. Okay, they're the ones that get von in the middle of their name. That means they're of the nobility, like Otto von Bismarck, right? Stuff like that. And they're generally conservative Prussian landholders. And after the Liberals win elections in 1862, he's going to be appointed chief minister by Wilhelm I, who's the Prussian king and eventually going to be the first Kaiser of Germany. And he rules with an iron fist. Bismarck will routinely voluntate social constructions and norms in order to get stuff done, basing his actions in something that he calls realpolitik, okay? And this is the idea that, like, the goal is to actually serve the state and that we're going to deal with realistic principles in order to get the needs of the state met. Okay, Germany is about to become a massive outlier here. When the rest of Europe is moving so that the state serves the people, Germany is becoming more militaristic, and it's moving in a direction in which the people are supposed to serve the state, right? This is going to become really important if you know anything about 20th century history with like World War I and World War II, the militarism and the people serving the state and stuff like that. Bismarck will do things like expand through war, and the perfect example of realpolitik is he says, we're not going to make the same mistakes we made in the past during the last attempted unification. We're not going to do this through things like speeches or majority decisions, quote unquote. Geez, yeah, I mean, that's insane. Why would we ever use anything like speeches or majority decisions? Instead, we're going to expand with stuff like blood and iron. So, like, expand through war if we need to, expand through like political machinations and influence. Power is going to be significantly more important than principles. Bismarck will pick a few wars that I'll talk about in a second, just to kind of eliminate Austrian influence and make Prussia kind of the dominant place. And he's also going to expand Germany's economic base. And the end result is that their ruthlessness gets results. As we've talked about, by the time the 20th century rolls around, the only country that can match Britain industrially, pound for pound, is Germany. The only country with like a massive, massive land military that can counteract the British Navy is Germany. And Germany is going to be like kind of the most primed for Central European domination, if that makes sense. And he's going to really expand the economic and industrial base and its resources and stuff like that. He is going to be less successful in trying to get colonies for Germany, but that's another story for a little bit later. Okay. Now, Bismarck is going to use 3 different wars in order to like unify Germany here. And the first is going to be, he's going to talk Austria-Prussia into invading a Danish province. And this is the Danish province by the name of Schleswig-Holstein. And this is the little area, and I'll show you on a map here in a second, of Denmark that kind of juts out like up into like where like the North Sea, not the North Sea, sorry, where like, the Baltic Sea, sorry, where the Baltic Sea and like comes over by like Sweden and stuff like that. And in doing this, what it's going to do is it's going to basically show like, hey, Austria and Prussia, like, look at us, we can like, take control of this area if we want to, and there are a number of ethnic Germans living in the area, and so he's going to drum up nationalism, and they're going to basically say, yeah, let's really like kind of join in like this area, and let's like they take this little Schleswig-Holstein part of like, which has historically been part of Denmark and stuff like that, and make it part of Germany because there are enough Germans living in the area, and we can do this through a combination of like nationalist influence and through the blood and iron, through like, physical violence and war if we need to. Now, when he gets done with this, he says something to Austria along the lines of like, how about you guys kind of govern this and we'll just take control over this, but it won't fully like, be ours and blah, blah, blah. It's purposely a weird arrangement, and Bismarck is no idiot, okay? Because he wants to go to war with Austria so he can carve off a few other Austrian states that he thinks belong to Germany. And he knows that having this weird arrangement where there's like partial taxation and partial government will eventually lead to war, okay? And in doing this, Bismarck basically picks a fight in which like Prussia can gain control of several northern German states. Okay, it's called the Austro-Prussian War. This is the second war of unification, right? It's going to last all of 7 weeks. This is how ready Bismarck is, okay? Like he has literally, and he's going to do this both now and with France, he's going to move his troops to like the railroad line and stuff like that weeks before this ever happens, so that the minute war is declared, he can basically move as fast as possible. And like as a result, Germany is going to take over like all of kind of the like northern states, if that makes sense, of the area like that will make up like modern Germany. I'll show you on a map in a second. The southern states are like Bavaria, etc., are left, and Saxony are left like independent, but like they end up forming military alliances with Prussia, and like slowly like Bismarck's just going to kind of leave his troops there and then kind of annex them, right? There's this last part on the eastern part of Germany, on the western part of France, on the border that he also wants to take control of, because this is the last kind of German state. And once Prussia has influence of like all the little German states, then they can, from Bismarck's point of view, unite in Berlin to form like one kind of Germany, if that makes sense. But he feels like he needs all of them, right? And so he baits the French into like a war over a small matter involving like French succession and like a small German state and stuff like that, right? Basically, Napoleon III, who had been Emperor of France, was demanding like compensation and like the ability to have influence over some German territories. And Bismarck was flat out refusing, right? And that's why I said a small matter of succession. This should never have led to a huge war. But in all honesty, like most historians would argue now, because Bismarck had his tracks on the ready, he had ammunition on the ready. He literally moved people right from Austria over to like Franco-Prussia, etc., etc. And they demolished France in 6 months, right? And this is really key because France is supposed to be the strongest land army in the world at this point. Anybody you talk to would fully admit that. And this really establishes like German superiority and dominance in Central Europe, okay? He does this by basically arguing that like German, like, the German people in the area of Alsace-Lorraine and stuff like that, this little area on the border of France and Germany, would be better off, and that they need to be supported by by this new German state, etc., etc. Um, and this really upsets the balance of power in Europe hardcore, because now Germany is dominant over Austria hardcore. Germany is dominant over France hardcore. This is actually the time that Britain says, okay, we don't have a history of loving France, but maybe we should get together with France in order to like be able to like deal with and counter Germany and stuff like that. At this point, Bismarck now assumes the role of chancellor, okay? And I'll show you on the map right here. So, uh, so this is Alsace-Lorraine, this little like brown thing right on the corner of France, like right over here, right near Baden. Okay, and that's what he's going to take. That's all he really wants, but he needs that small part in like, the Franco-Prussian War, the first part in the Danish War. Schleswig-Holstein is up top, right by Lübeck. And then you have like these other states, Silesia and Posen and stuff like that, that he like, was helping to like take over during the Austrian like war, etc., etc. Okay, and Bismarck is going to become chancellor. The Kaiser is going to be Kaiser Wilhelm. This is actually a grandson-in-law, I'm pretty sure, of Queen Victoria, and then like his Victoria's daughter ends up marrying him, or sorry, son-in-law of Queen Victoria. Victoria's daughter ends up marrying him, and then like they end up related kind of that way. And now Germany is united in 1871 into the Second Reich. Okay, people always talk about the Third Reich, which is obviously Nazi Germany. The First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire. This is the Second Reich, the German Empire that existed from 1871 until the end of World War I, which is 1918 or so. Okay, so from 1871 to 1918, and Germany is completely united. And Bismarck is now going to set up something called the Bismarckian system, where he's basically going to spend the rest of his time as chancellor messing with France as much as possible and trying to weaken France and French power and set up alliances that isolate France and stuff along those lines. Okay, just so you guys know, these are not the only kind of nationalist movements going on at this time. None of these are ones that I want you to know a ton about or anything like that, but I do want you to realize that, like, as a result of nationalism and the famine and stuff like that, Ireland has a series of movements that we'll talk about later. It's going to try again and again and again to rebel, and it's going to lead to rebellion, civil war, etc., etc. The Balkans, which is the area kind of right above Greece, what would eventually be known as Yugoslavia and stuff like that, they're trying to break away and form a large state, most notably Serbia. All this is going to be a result of nationalism. This is where World War I is going to start. We'll talk about this later. France has a number of internal issues. France is supposed to be a very liberal country, but the rise of nationalism and who is French and what makes somebody French and stuff along these lines leads to something called the Dreyfus Affair, in which like a French soldier who's Jewish is wrongly accused and convicted of treason, and it leads to people like arguing with some of the problems and talking about some of the problems with blind nationalism and stuff like that. Russia has, as I said, a decaying empire and kind of some huge like small national, or huge and small national movements to deal with. Like small in that like a few people, or like they're kind of poorly organized, but huge in that like a lot of people can get behind them really quickly. And then what is going to be modern day Turkey, the Ottoman Empire. We haven't talked about it a ton, but it's in the process of also falling apart. And a dude by the name of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk is trying to create a secular independent state by the name of Turkey. And we'll talk about all these later, but these are all nationalist results also going on at the same time. Okay, so where does that leave us, guys? Now that we have talked about everything but the imperialism part of Europe in the like 19th century or so, well, it leaves Britain and Europe as the two, or sorry, Britain and Europe. Sorry, it leaves Britain and Germany as the two most powerful nations in Europe. Okay, Germany's going to do everything it can to try to isolate France through like a series of like alliances, and Britain's going to counter all of those with their own alliances. So like Germany's going to ally with Austria, Britain's going to ally with France, Germany's going to try to get Russia involved, Russia's going to say no, Britain's going to try to get Russia involved, Russia's going to say yes, etc., right? France is kind of in third place. They're defeated, but they're still really strong. They still have a huge land army, and they're still considered to be one of the hugest military powers in the world. As Americans, we often get this running joke that France is not a military power. That is a reputation that comes out of World War II. That is not something that historically was true. France was actually one of the strongest land armies in Europe, if not the strongest over an extended period of time. And Austria and Russia are starting to lag behind and are starting to kind of slowly fall apart. Not quite as bad shape as the Ottoman Empire, which is like, pretty much already falling apart. But that's where kind of the six major countries of Europe, it's really, because before we had Prussia, Russia, France, Britain, and Austria-Hungary. Now what we have is Germany, Russia, France, Britain, and Austria-Hungary, right? And that's kind of where they sit. And the Ottoman Empire would kind of be the other major, huge power in Europe. A lot of these small countries have been eaten up. If I gave you like a map test of Europe right now, it'd be really easy. They're only like, 15, 20 countries rather than the normal like 45 or something like that. Because the Ottoman Empire is falling apart, there is tons of unrest in the Balkans and tons of nationalist movements going on. And these other states are going to vie for how to get power for them. And the end result is that the seeds are now sown between industrialism and nationalism and balance of power and stuff like that for the biggest conflict, which is going to be the 20th century, starting with World War I. All right, y'all, that's all I've got on nationalism intro and stuff like that for you guys today. We will be talking about this more in class as we kind of go through the course of the next few days or so. And then a lot of these things will come up later on, so feel free to go back to this anytime you want to review or to go over any kind of the information or content or stuff like that. Have a good one, y'all, and I will talk to you soon.